The station Valuri 7 floated in the dark between stars, quiet and massive, turning slowly like a sleeping wheel. It had been in orbit around its blue star for over 200 years. Inside it, thousands of students from dozens of worlds went to class, ate their food, argued in hallways, and tried to figure out what they wanted to do with their lives. It was, in every way, a normal school. Except that nothing about it was really normal at all. The main hall was the biggest room on the station. It had curved walls and tall windows that looked out at the stars. The floor was wide and smooth, and there were rows of seats that folded down from the walls. Students of every shape and size sat in those seats each morning for the daily announcements. Some had 4 arms. Some had no arms at all. Some were tall and thin, some were small and round, some glowed softly in the dark, and some smelled like wet rock. Cole Harmon sat near the back, next to his 2 friends. On his left was Pri, who had 4 arms, pale green skin, and big black eyes that could see in almost total darkness. Pri came from a colony world where the gravity was so low that the buildings were held down with cables. On his right was Luma, who was tall and blue and faintly glowing. Luma's skin changed brightness depending on how Luma was feeling. Right now, Luma was glowing a calm, steady light blue, which meant everything was fine. Cole was the only human in the room. There were 2 other humans on the station, but they were older students who mostly kept to themselves. Cole did not keep to himself. He had, over the past several months, managed to make friends with students from 9 different species, learn 4 words in 6 alien languages, and convince the food station to stock something called a breakfast burrito, which he had eaten every single morning since. He had a notebook open on his knee. Not a digital one. A paper one with a blue cover and a pen tucked into the spiral binding. He drew in it during boring lectures. Today he was drawing a bird he had seen in a documentary the night before, something called a secretary bird from back on Earth, which apparently stomped snakes to death with its feet. He thought that was impressive. Headmaster Voss walked onto the platform at the front of the hall. Voss was old. Incredibly old. He was a reptilian being from a world called Keth Minor, and his kind lived for a very long time. His scales were a deep greenish gray, and he moved slowly, with the careful dignity of someone who had been doing this job for longer than most species had been building cities. Everyone in the hall went quiet when he walked in. Voss did not waste time. He stood at the podium and folded his hands and looked out at the crowd. He said that the Galactic Council had approved a new exercise for the current semester. He said it was a first of its kind. He said it was designed to teach students something important about how living beings respond to real danger. Then he said the word Zeth. The hall changed. It was not a dramatic change. It was the kind of change that happens when a cold wind comes through a window you forgot to close. A stillness settled over the students, and then, very quietly, a sound began to build. It was not screaming. It was smaller than that. It was the sound of hundreds of beings making the soft, involuntary noises that bodies make when they hear something they do not like. Pri made a clicking sound low in its throat. Luma's glow dropped immediately from calm light blue to a pale, flickering gray. Cole looked up from his notebook. He had heard the word before. He knew roughly what a Zeth was. Apex predator, Keth Nebula system, large, dangerous, good at hiding, bad to be around. He had read about it once in a species database when he was supposed to be studying orbital mechanics. He had thought it sounded interesting. Voss continued speaking. He explained that a live Zeth, a single specimen, would be housed in a contained area of the station for the duration of the exercise. Students would observe it in controlled sessions. They would take notes. They would write reports on their own reactions. The goal, Voss said in his slow, careful voice, was to help students understand how their minds and bodies responded to genuine threat. It was a learning experience. Everything was very safe. The containment was very strong. The faculty would be present at all times. Pri leaned over to Cole and said, in a whisper, that a Zeth had once dissolved an entire research team on a survey mission. Not eaten them. Dissolved them. Pri wanted to be clear about that distinction. Cole nodded slowly. He wrote the word Zeth at the top of a new page in his notebook. Then, underneath it, he wrote the words, visual hunter or scent hunter. And, does loud noise help or hurt? And, what does it do when something doesn't run? Luma looked at what he was writing and made a soft sound that, in Luma's language, roughly translated to, "Why are you like this?" After the announcements ended, the students spilled out into the corridors. Cole walked with Pri and Luma toward their first class of the day. The hallways were loud. Everyone was talking about the Zeth. A group of students from a warrior species called the Voran were standing in a circle near the water dispensers, speaking in low tones and looking serious. Two avian students perched on a high rail above the crowd, fluffing their feathers in what Cole had learned was a stress response. Even a pair of mineral-based students, who were normally too slow-moving and calm to be bothered by much of anything, had stopped walking entirely and were just standing in the middle of the corridor, not moving at all. Cole stepped around them. Pri asked if Cole was not frightened. Pri said this with genuine curiosity and also a hint of accusation, the way you ask someone why they are not upset at something that is very clearly upsetting. Cole thought about it. He said he was a little curious. He said he had grown up not far from a national forest, and that when he was 8 years old his grandmother had shown him how to tell if a bear had been through an area by looking at the scratch marks on trees and the way the undergrowth was pushed down. He said that when he was 12, he had walked around a bend on a trail and come face to face with a black bear about 4 meters away. He said he had not run. He said his grandmother had told him never to run. Pri stared at him with all 4 eyes. Pri asked what a black bear was. Cole described it. About 150 kilograms, he said. Dark fur. Strong. Fast when it wanted to be. Mostly interested in food, not in fighting, but very capable of both. Luma, who had been listening, asked what Cole had done when he met the bear on the trail. Cole said he had stood still and spoken in a calm voice and slowly backed away, and that the bear had watched him for a moment and then gone back to eating berries. There was a pause. Pri said that the Zeth was considerably larger than 150 kilograms and considerably less interested in berries. Cole said that was fair. But he also said that the basic logic seemed similar. He said most predators were not interested in a fight unless they were hungry or cornered or something had already run from them. He said running was usually the worst thing you could do. He said he was curious whether a Zeth followed the same logic. Luma's glow went a faint, uncertain yellow. They arrived at class. The lecturer, a 6-limbed being named Professor Dant, spent the first 10 minutes of the session not talking about the scheduled topic at all, but instead reassuring the students that the containment protocols were extremely reliable and that no one was in any danger. Most of the students looked like they needed to hear this. Cole was drawing the Zeth from memory based on the image in the species database. He gave it careful eyes. That evening, back in the dormitory, Cole sat by the long window in the common room and looked out at the stars. Pri sat across from him, organizing notes. Luma sat on the low couch nearby, glowing a quiet, thoughtful orange. Pri asked Cole, again, if he was truly not afraid. Cole looked at the stars for a moment. Then he said that he was a little afraid. He said it would be stupid not to be. But he said that being afraid and not being able to think were two different things, and that Earth had taught him a long time ago that the second one was the real problem. Luma asked what Earth was like. Cole smiled a little. He said it was beautiful. He said it was also absolutely full of things that would kill you, and that humans had spent about 10,000 years figuring out how to live there anyway. The stars outside the window did not move. The station turned slowly. Somewhere deep in the lower levels, in a sealed and reinforced room, something very large and very patient waited in the dark. Cole turned a new page in his notebook and kept writing his questions. The observation hall had been converted specifically for the exercise. It was a long, wide room near the outer ring of the station, with walls that had been reinforced with layers of composite plating. Along one side ran a barrier of thick transparent material, something that the faculty described as completely unbreakable. Behind that barrier was a space roughly the size of a large gymnasium, filled with dim light and fabricated terrain. Low rock shapes. Shallow depressions in the floor. A few artificial trees that were little more than gray pillars with branches attached. Faculty member Dree stood at the entrance to the observation area and checked names off a list as students filed in. Dree was avian, with golden feathers and a sharp, nervous beak. Dree had been doing this for 3 years and was normally calm during student exercises. Today, Dree's feathers were pressed flat against their body, which in avian biology was the equivalent of gripping the armrests very tightly. Students entered in groups of 12. They were told to stand in the marked zone, which was a strip of floor about 4 meters back from the transparent barrier. They were told to keep their voices low. They were told not to press against the barrier under any circumstances. They were told that if they felt overwhelmed, they could step back to the secondary waiting area at any time, no questions asked. The first group went in. 12 students of various species. Within 30 seconds of the room's interior lights adjusting, something moved in the back of the enclosed space. It was large. It moved in a way that was difficult to track, not because it was fast, but because it seemed to occupy space strangely, like the eye kept deciding it must be a shadow and then realizing it was not. 3 of the 12 students went immediately to the secondary waiting area. 2 more backed against the far wall and did not move. The remaining 7 stood in the marked zone, very still, watching. The Zeth moved to the barrier and looked at them. It was enormous. Easily 3 meters at the shoulder, with a body that was long and low and built for cover. Its skin was dark, with a texture that seemed to shift faintly depending on the light. It had no obvious eyes in the place one expected eyes to be, which made it worse, not better, because that meant it was looking at you and you could not tell where it was looking. It moved along the barrier slowly, as though it was reading the students one by one. Every group had more or less the same reaction. Stillness, then backing away, then a slow reapproach from those who were steadier. A few students pressed their faces near the barrier and watched with academic intensity. Most stayed well back. Dree watched all of this from the entrance with careful eyes and took detailed notes. Cole's group was the 4th. Cole walked in with Pri and Luma and 9 other students. Luma's glow was already a muted gray before they had even crossed the threshold. Pri had all 4 arms crossed tight against its chest, which was a posture Cole had come to recognize as Pri trying very hard not to look like it was frightened. The Zeth was at the far end of the space when they entered. Cole looked at it immediately and did not look away. The others in the group shifted toward the back of the mark zone without quite deciding to. Cole moved to the front. Dree called out, quietly but firmly, that the marked zone boundary was there for a reason. Cole was still in the zone. He had stopped about a step behind the front line of the zone marker and was standing still, watching the Zeth. He had his notebook open. The Zeth turned. It had, in the time since the first group, moved through several behavior cycles that the faculty had seen before. It tested the barrier. It paced. It made sudden lunges at the transparent wall to observe flinch responses. It had a rhythm to it, almost like it was bored and playing. When the Zeth turned and saw Cole, it stopped. Not slowed down. Stopped. The way a clock stops. Completely. Cole did not move. He was writing something in his notebook without looking down at the page, which was a habit he had developed during long field observations back home. He kept his eyes on the Zeth. The Zeth kept its not quite visible gaze on him. Dree, at the entrance, had gone very still. The Zeth walked to the barrier. Slowly. Not in the lunging way it had moved with the other groups. This was different. It came to the barrier directly in front of Cole and stopped again. It was close enough that its breath fogged the transparent surface. Cole wrote one more word in his notebook. Then he looked up fully. They looked at each other for a long time. Cole counted silently in his head. 1, 2, 3. He had learned, from a very young age, that in most territorial animal encounters, the one who looked away first was deciding something. He did not look away. Behind him, he could hear Pri making a sound very quietly that had no translation but meant approximately, "I am going to pass out." At about the 4-minute mark, Cole did something that made Dree inhale sharply and made 2 faculty observers in the back room nearly knock over their recording equipment. He tapped the barrier twice with 2 fingers. Lightly. Like knocking on a door. It was not an aggressive gesture. It was not a fearful gesture. It was a greeting. Or at least the closest thing he could think of that translated across the gap between them. The Zeth tilted its head. A slow, deliberate movement. Cole tilted his head back. Mirroring it. The Zeth held that position for about 10 seconds. Then it stepped back 1 step. Then it turned and walked to the far end of the space and lay down. The observation session ended shortly after. Dree dismissed Cole's group with the kind of voice one uses when one has just witnessed something that needs to be processed before any words are chosen. In the corridor outside, Pri sat down on the floor without warning. Priya's legs had simply stopped cooperating. Luma's glow had gone a very bright, startled white, which was the bioluminescent equivalent of standing up very fast. Pri said, from the floor, that Cole had just had a staring contest with a Zeth. Cole said that was not exactly what it was. He said he had just been watching it. He said it was interesting. Luma asked what the tapping was about. Cole said he was not entirely sure. He said it had worked on dogs, sometimes, and once on a very suspicious raccoon. He said it was worth trying. He said the point was to communicate that he was not a threat and not prey, and that any signal that was calm and deliberate and non-aggressive was worth trying when you were looking at something large and uncertain. Pri, still on the floor, said that raccoon was a word it had now heard from Cole 3 times and it still had no idea what it was. Cole sat down next to Pri on the corridor floor and described raccoons. Medium-sized. Masked face. Surprisingly smart. Could open latches. Ate almost anything. Often found in trash near human homes. Pri listened with its 4 arms still tight against its chest. Luma, standing above both of them, said quietly that the Zeth had behaved differently with Cole than with every other group. Luma said this in the careful way of someone who was noting a fact they did not yet have a category for. Cole said he had noticed. That evening, the faculty observations were reviewed in a closed session. Dre presented the footage and the behavioral log. The Zeth had made at least one aggressive lunge or charge toward the barrier with every other student group. With Cole's group, it had not. With Cole specifically, it had displayed what the behavioral analysts classified as assessment behavior rather than predatory behavior. The difference, the analysts explained, was significant. Assessment behavior was what a predator did when it was not sure what it was looking at. One of the council observers, a short gray being from a species called the Vor, watched the footage twice. Watched the moment where Cole tapped the barrier. Watched the Zeth tilt its head. The Vor observer said nothing. But they watched it a 3rd time. Back in the dormitory, Cole sat by the window again and added to his notes. He wrote that the Zeth seemed more curious than aggressive given the right conditions. He wrote that maintaining stillness and making deliberate non-threatening gestures had changed its behavior. He wrote a question, does it respond to individuals differently, or to behaviors? He underlined the question twice. Outside the window, the blue star turned slowly in the dark, and the station turned around it, and deep in the observation hall, the Zeth lay in the dim light with its head resting on its front limbs, doing what apex predators sometimes did when nothing interesting was happening. It waited. The memo came on a Tuesday. Faculty member Dre found it in their message queue early in the morning, before most of the station was awake, and read it 3 times before calling Headmaster Voss. The Galactic Council observers had reviewed all of the behavioral data from the first round of observation sessions. They had noted the standard responses from all species groups. They had also, at length, noted the response of Cadet Cole Harmon of Earth. And they had decided that the exercise needed to escalate. The next phase was a survival simulation. This was not unusual. The council had run survival simulations at various academies before. 6 students would be placed inside a large enclosed environment, a fabricated wilderness space on the station's outer ring, and the Zeth would be released into that space with them. Unrestrained. The simulation would last 60 minutes. The stated purpose was to observe natural survival behavior under genuine threat conditions. Faculty member Dre spent most of that morning trying to find a diplomatic way to object. By midday, Dre had not found one. The 6 students selected were Pri, Luma, a mineral-based student named Garath, 2 avian siblings named Syrah and Sola, and Cole. Cole was told about the selection at dinner. He set down his fork, thought about it for a moment, and then picked his fork back up and continued eating. Pri, who received the same message at the same moment, did not pick up its fork again for quite some time. The simulation space was larger than the observation hall. Much larger. It was a full fabricated ecosystem, about the size of 3 football fields, with terrain that had hills and gullies and patches of synthetic vegetation. The light inside was dim and green, like a forest in the late afternoon. It smelled like soil. Real soil, imported and spread across the floor to a depth of several centimeters. The air was thick and still. The 6 students entered through a hatch in the wall and stood together near the entrance for a moment. Nobody spoke. Garath, who was roughly the shape and size of a large boulder and usually moved very slowly, had already begun the mineral stress response, which meant its body was hardening and its movement was slowing. This was an involuntary biological process and Garath could not stop it. Sira and Sola, the avian siblings, looked at the ceiling and then at each other and then, without a word, flew straight up to the highest point in the space, which was a series of fabricated rock outcroppings near the top of the outer wall. They landed there and went completely still and silent. This was also a biological stress response. For avians, height meant safety. Luma's glow was off. Completely off, for the first time Cole had ever seen. In the dim green light, Luma looked like a shadow of a person. Pri had gone into the undergrowth near the wall and climbed the nearest tall structure, which was a fabricated tree trunk about 6 meters high. Pri was up it in under 8 seconds and had all 4 arms wrapped around the top. Cole stood alone near the center of the entry area. The hatch behind them sealed. A low tone sounded. And from somewhere deeper in the space, a sound came that had no human equivalent. It was not a roar. It was lower than that. A kind of pressure change more than a sound, something that the body felt before the ears heard it. It meant the Zeth was awake and aware and moving. Cole breathed in slowly through his nose. He could smell the soil. He could smell the synthetic vegetation. And beneath that, something else. Something faintly metallic and alive. He began to move. He did not move fast. He moved the way he had learned to move in dense forest, which was carefully and with his weight spread evenly, so that his footfalls were soft. He looked at the terrain as he walked. He was building a map in his head. The hills gave cover but also blocked sight lines. The gullies channeled movement. There were 3 spots in the space that he could identify as defensible: a shallow rock formation to the northeast, a denser cluster of synthetic trees near the center left, and a spot near the western wall where the terrain rose sharply and then flattened, creating a natural raised platform. He identified the wind direction from the way the synthetic vegetation was bending. Faint, but present. He moved upwind. In the faculty observation room above, a team of 12 researchers and 2 council representatives watched the feed. The 5 other students were motionless. Garath was a frozen shape in the entry area. Sira and Sola were pressed against the rock face above. Pri was at the top of the fabricated tree, not moving. Luma was lying flat in a shallow depression in the soil, barely visible. Cole was the only student moving. The researchers tracked him on 3 separate cameras. The Zeth was also moving. It was heading northeast. It had picked up something. It moved in long, low sweeps, covering ground efficiently. It was heading toward the shallow depression where Luma was hiding. Cole saw it. He did not run. That was the thing that made one of the researchers stand up from her chair without realizing it. He saw the Zeth heading toward Luma's position and he changed direction and began moving toward the Zeth. Deliberately. With purpose. He snapped a branch. One sharp crack. The sound was small but in the dense, still air of the simulation space it carried clearly. The Zeth stopped. It turned. Cole and the Zeth were across a clearing from each other, roughly 15 meters apart, with a stretch of open ground between them. Cole stood still. The Zeth was perfectly, completely still. The kind of stillness that a large predator achieves right before it decides what to do. Cole's hands were shaking. He noted this with the detached part of his mind that stayed calm during emergencies and simply observed what the rest of him was doing. His heartbeat was fast. His breathing wanted to go shallow and he was making it stay slow. His body was giving him every instruction that bodies give when they are in danger, and he was listening to all of those instructions and making a deliberate choice not to follow the one that said run. The Zeth circled left. Slowly. Cole tracked it without turning his back. He rotated, keeping his front facing it, moving only enough to stay facing it. His voice came out low and even and he said, quietly, "I see you. I'm not running. I'm not going anywhere. You can look all you want." It did not matter that the Zeth did not speak English. The tone was what mattered. Low, steady, not threatening, not submissive. Just present. The Zeth circled a second time. Then it stopped again. For 40 seconds they stood without moving. Then the Zeth turned and moved away, back toward the center of the space. Cole stayed where he was until it had gone fully out of sight. Then he breathed out and went to check on Luma. Luma was in the shallow depression, still entirely dark, still lying flat. Cole crouched down next to Luma and said, quietly, that it was okay. Luma's glow came back on, very faint and very pale, but on. For the rest of the simulation, Cole moved through the space slowly and carefully, putting himself in positions between the Zeth and the other students. He did not confront it again. He used the terrain the way he had learned to use terrain, staying aware of where the Zeth was from the sounds it made and the direction the air moved, and steering clear of the places where the path was too direct and too obvious. When the 60 minutes ended and the hatch opened, all 6 students walked out. Garath was unharmed, still slightly hardened but recovering. Syrah and Sola came down from the rock face and were unharmed. Pri climbed down from the fabricated tree and its legs were shaking, but it was fine. Luma walked out close to Cole and did not speak for several minutes. In the debrief room, Headmaster Voss reviewed the footage alone before the session began. He watched the moment where Cole walked toward the Zeth rather than away. He watched the circling. He watched the moment where Cole stayed still and the Zeth turned and left. Voss asked Cole a question. Just one. He said, "Where did you learn to do that?" Cole thought about his grandmother on a trail in October, the air smelling like dead leaves, her voice calm and practical, explaining how you stood your ground and let something large and dangerous decide you were not worth the trouble. He said, "Earth. You kind of had to." The alarm came at 2:14 station time. It was not the kind of alarm that meant a small problem. The lights in the corridor shifted from their normal pale white to a deep amber, and the sound was steady and low, not the sharp urgent tone that meant fire or hull breach. It was the code for biological containment failure, which was, in its own way, worse than both. Cole was already awake. He had been reading, sitting on his bunk with a small light on, working through a book about animal tracking that he had found in the station's old physical library 3 weeks ago. When the alarm shifted the corridor lights to amber, he put the book face down on his knee and listened. The announcement came 40 seconds later. A calm, automated voice that said there had been a malfunction in the lower service corridor systems during a scheduled maintenance cycle. It said the situation was being managed. It said all students should remain in their dormitory wings and await further instruction. Cole got up and put on his boots. Pri, from the upper bunk, said in a very tired voice that the announcement had specifically said to stay in the dormitories. Cole said yes. Pri asked what he was doing. Cole said he was putting on his boots. Pri looked at the amber light in the corridor outside their door and said, slowly, that the boots were going on because Cole was not going to stay in the dormitory. Cole said that there were students in the lower service wings. The dormitory assignment map was on the shared board at the end of the corridor. He had looked at it before because he found the station layout interesting. He said roughly 11 students plus at least 3 maintenance workers were assigned to areas that were now in the lockdown zone. Pri was quiet for a moment. Then Pri said, with great sincerity and some desperation, "Please do not do this." Cole said he would take a comm badge and check in every 10 minutes. He said he would be careful. He said that Pri and Luma should stay and that was not negotiable. He took the corridor map from the shared display, folded it, put it in his pocket. He took a mylar emergency blanket from the wall kit near the door, the kind kept in every corridor for cold emergencies, and wrapped it around himself loosely. He had read, in the species database file on Zeth, that their primary detection method below 3 meters distance was thermal. The mylar would disrupt his heat signature enough to matter. He walked out. The corridors were quiet. Most students had followed the announcement. The amber light made everything look strange, made familiar hallways look like somewhere else entirely. Cole moved quickly but not carelessly. He was paying attention to sounds. The station's background hum was constant and he was listening underneath it for anything that was not part of that hum. He reached the access point for the lower service wing and found it locked. This was expected. He used the emergency override panel beside the door, which required a student access code and a physical reason, and he typed into the reason field, "Student welfare check, potential isolates in lockdown zone." The door opened. This was not the correct use of the emergency override. He would deal with that later. On the other side of the door, the lighting was worse. The service corridors ran between the station's outer hull and its habitable ring. They were functional spaces, not designed for comfort. Pipes ran along the ceiling. The floor was metal grating. The sound changed, became more metallic and hollow. Cole activated his comm badge and reached Security Chief Era. Era was a veteran officer of a species known for measured responses and tactical precision. She had wide flat eyes and spoke in clipped, efficient sentences. She was currently managing the situation from the security station on level 4 and was very busy. When Cole identified himself and told her his location and what he was doing, she did not respond immediately. Then she said, "Cadet Harmon, you have violated a lockdown order." Cole said yes and then kept talking. He described his route. He described the thermal disruption he had arranged. He described his assessment of where the Zeth was likely to have gone based on how Zeth used terrain, which was, away from open space, toward tight enclosed areas with only 1 or 2 access points, because unfamiliar environments triggered den-seeking behavior in most ambush hunters. He said he had a map and a plan and a very accurate idea of where the missing students were likely to be. There was a pause on the line. Era's second-in-command could be heard in the background asking if they should physically retrieve the cadet. Era said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "No, track him." And she said to Cole, "Check in every 8 minutes. Go." It took Cole 11 minutes to find the first group of students. For beings of 2 different species, all huddled in a maintenance storage room with the door pulled shut from the inside. They had barricaded it with a shelf unit. Cole knocked, gave his name, and talked them through unlocking the door. He checked the corridor in both directions and then led them back along the path the Zeth had already traveled, which he had identified by marks in a light layer of grime on the grating. A predator in an unfamiliar space moved forward, not backward. The path it had come from was safe. He found 2 more students near the water processing junction, hiding behind a bank of machinery. Then 3 more in a crawl space near the power lines. Then the 3 maintenance workers, all of them together in a control room with a locked door and no windows, who had been in communication with the security team but could not be reached without going into the corridor. Each time, Cole moved in the same way. He checked the direction of air movement. He listened. He moved slowly and kept close to the walls. He spoke quietly to the people he found and moved them back along the cleared path. He was heading for the last 2 missing students, a pair of first-year avians who were too young and too frightened to have climbed to safety, when he turned a corner and found a dead end. The map had an error. The corridor he was in ended at a sealed maintenance hatch that should have connected to the next section but had been sealed over during a repair cycle 3 years ago. The map had not been updated. And the Zeth was at the other end of the corridor. It was about 20 meters away. It had come from a side passage. It was large in the narrow corridor in a way that felt total, the way a wall is large, except that this wall was breathing and watching him. Cole stopped. The Mylar had bought him distance, but he was in the corridor now and there was nowhere else to be. He did what he knew how to do. He planted his feet. He made himself as still as possible. He breathed carefully and slowly. He looked at the Zeth, not directly into the approximate location of its eyes, but at its body, the way you looked at something big to read its intention rather than challenge it. He began to talk. Low voice, steady pace. He said whatever came to mind. He described the station layout. He described what the maintenance corridors were used for. He described the view from the window in the common room and how the blue star looked different colors at different times of day. He described his grandmother's house and the way the trees looked in October and the sound the leaves made when the wind came through them. The Zeth did not move. 6 minutes passed. Cole kept talking. His voice did not shake. The suppression team arrived through the far access point 7 minutes later. 4 officers in full protective gear with long-range sedation equipment. They found Cole sitting cross-legged on the metal grating, 7 meters from the Zeth, still talking. The team lead later said, in her official report, that in 14 years of Zeth management operations she had never seen the animal sitting down. The review session was held in the council chamber on level 2. It had high ceilings and long tables arranged in a curved shape, the kind of room designed to make discussions feel formal and important. 7 council representatives sat on one side. Headmaster Voss sat at a smaller table facing them. 2 of the academy's senior faculty members sat beside him. A recording device sat in the center of the main table, its small indicator light glowing red. They had been in the session for 2 hours before Cole was called in. He sat down in the single chair across from the council and put his hands on his knees and waited. The council representative who spoke first was a tall being with 6 limbs and pale silver skin. Its name was Counselor Het, and it represented a species that had been spacefaring for 800 years. It spoke carefully, in the measured tone of someone who had been in many rooms like this one and understood how they worked. Het said that the council had reviewed all available data from the Zeth exercise. It said the data was thorough and the observations were clear. It said that Cadet Harmon had, on multiple occasions, responded to the presence of a certified apex predator in ways that the council's existing behavioral models did not predict and could not fully explain. Het asked Cole to explain himself. Cole looked at the council for a moment. Then he said that he was not sure what specifically needed explaining, and could they be more specific. This was apparently not the opening the council had expected. Counselor Het consulted its notes. It said that Cole had, on the first day of observation, voluntarily approached the barrier and made extended eye contact with the Zeth. It said that Cole had, during the survival simulation, moved toward the Zeth rather than away from it. It said that during the containment failure, Cole had entered a lockdown zone alone, located 14 individuals, guided them to safety, and then been found sitting in close proximity to the Zeth, apparently having a conversation with it. Het said that no other student of any species in the recorded history of this exercise had demonstrated this pattern of behavior. Cole nodded. He said that made sense. He said that most of the species at the Academy had come from worlds where the dominant strategy for survival was to develop civilization quickly enough to build walls and cities and eventually space stations, so that you did not have to be personally responsible for dealing with things that wanted to eat you. He said humans had tried that too, and it had worked, mostly. But he said that Earth was a specific kind of place, and that for most of human history the walls were not always there, and the cities were not always close, and sometimes you were just a person in a large dark space with something that could kill you. He said the thing humans had learned, over a very long time, was not that the dangerous thing could be defeated. He said it was more than that. He said the dangerous thing could be understood. Or at least read, the way you read a sentence, one signal at a time, until you had enough information to make a decision. Counselor Het asked if Cole was afraid during these encounters. Cole said yes. He said every time. He said during the simulation his hands were shaking and his heart was going fast enough that he could feel it in his throat. He said during the corridor situation he had been frightened enough that part of his mind was very loudly suggesting he try to climb the pipes on the ceiling, which would not have worked but which his nervous system was prepared to attempt anyway. One of the other council representatives, a broad, dark-feathered avian named Counselor Wren, leaned forward and said that this was the part the council struggled to understand. It said that if Cole was genuinely frightened, then his behavior was irrational. It said that fear existed to drive avoidance behavior. It said the correct and rational response to a Zeth was to be frightened and to leave. Cole thought about this for a moment. He said that was one way to look at it. He said the other way to look at it was that fear was information, not a command. He said his body was giving him information about the danger and he was taking that information seriously. He said being afraid told him to pay attention and to be careful, not to stop thinking. Wren said that most species did not experience fear that way. Cole said he knew. He said he thought it was because most species had not grown up somewhere that required it. The third council representative was the Vor Elder who had watched the observation footage 3 times in the first week. Her name was Elder Sohn, and she was the oldest person in the room by a margin of several centuries. She had not spoken yet. When she spoke now, the room went quiet in a way that suggested it always did when she spoke. She asked Cole to tell her about Earth. Not the data, she said. She said she had read the data. She said she wanted to know what it was like. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he talked about Earth. He talked about it the way you talk about a place you grew up in, with the particular mix of love and clear-eyed honesty that comes from knowing somewhere very well. He said it was beautiful. He said the oceans were enormous and the mountains were old and there were forests that had been growing for longer than his species had been using tools. He said there was a kind of light you only got at certain times of day that made everything look like it had been painted by someone who really cared about the job. He said it was also a place where, for most of human history, the measure of a good day was that you had made it through it. He said the planet had large animals that could end a person very quickly. He said it had smaller animals that could end a person more slowly and less pleasantly. He said it had weather events and geological events and diseases, and that the land itself in many places was not reliably safe to stand on. He said humans had not been given a protected corner of this world to develop in. They had been in the middle of all of it from the beginning. He said what came out of that was not people without fear. He said he wanted to be clear about that. He said humans were not brave in the way that the word was sometimes used, meaning unafraid. He said they were afraid regularly and specifically and in great detail. They were afraid of the dark, afraid of heights, afraid of fast things with teeth, afraid of enclosed spaces, afraid of open ones. But he said that Earth had also, over 10,000 years, built into them something that ran alongside the fear. A kind of stubbornness. A refusal to let the fear be the last word. An ability to be terrified and still move their feet, still make a plan, still look the dangerous thing in the eye and think, what do I know about this, and what can I do with what I know? Elder Sohn did not respond immediately. She sat with her hands folded and looked at Cole for a long time. Then she said, very carefully, that she thought the council had made an error in the framing of the exercise. She said they had designed it to demonstrate that fear was universal and that threat response was predictable. She said the data did not support that conclusion. Headmaster Voss, from the smaller table, said that he had a recommendation. He recommended that the survival exercise be formally reclassified in the academic record, not as a fear management assessment, but as a first contact analog exercise. He said this would more accurately reflect what the exercise had actually demonstrated. He said he also recommended, with respect, that human psychology be added as a required module for all senior faculty and council observers beginning next semester. Counselor Het asked if that recommendation was directed at the council. Voss said it was directed at everyone in the room. The motion on reclassification passed. The module recommendation was referred to the academic committee, which Voss considered to be close enough to a yes for now. When Cole left the chamber, he found Pri and Luma waiting in the corridor outside. Luma was glowing a warm orange, which was the bioluminescent equivalent of relief. Pri had all four arms folded and was watching the door with an expression Cole had come to know well, which was the expression Pri made when something had turned out fine but Pri was not yet prepared to admit that it had turned out fine. Luma asked how it went. Cole said it was fine. He said they mostly just wanted to ask questions. Pri said, flatly, that they had been in there for 2 hours. Cole said there were a lot of questions. The three of them walked back toward the main corridor together. The station's lights were back to their normal pale white. The service corridors had been cleared and the hatch sealed properly this time. Somewhere in the lower observation area, the Zeth had been returned to its enclosure after the suppression team's sedative wore off, and was now, according to the daily report, eating and moving normally. Pri said, after a while, that it had been thinking about what Cole had described. About Earth. About the animals. Pri said it had looked up the black bear in the species database and that it was, in fact, considerably less frightening than a Zeth, but that the database did note it was capable of running at approximately 55 km per hour and climbing trees, which Pri found troubling. Luma said that it had looked up raccoons and had a lot of questions. Cole smiled. He said he would answer all the raccoon questions. He said they were genuinely interesting animals and got a bad reputation because they lived near people, but that they were smart and adaptable and had figured out how to thrive in a world that had changed enormously around them, which he thought deserved some credit. Pri said that this was exactly the kind of thing Cole would say about an animal that went through trash. They turned a corner and the common room was ahead of them, warm and lit, with the wide window beyond it showing the stars and the blue star turning slowly in the dark. Cole sat down in his usual spot. He opened his notebook. On the last page he had used, at the top, was the question he had written the very first night, after the announcement in the main hall. Does it respond to individuals differently, or to behaviors? He thought about it for a moment. Then he wrote, underneath it, in small careful letters, both. It responds to both. It can tell when something has decided it is not afraid. He looked out at the stars. Luma sat nearby and glowed a quiet, steady gold. Pri sat across from him and said nothing for a while, and then said that it supposed, all things considered, that having a human around was probably useful. Cole said he would take that. The station turned. The stars did not move. And in the old species database, in a file that had not been updated in several decades, the entry for Homo sapiens still read, in its final line, caution advised. Threat response classification, unpredictable. Somewhere, in a review session that was still ongoing, Elder Sohn was suggesting that the entry needed to be rewritten. She was suggesting that unpredictable was not the right word. She said the right word was adaptive. The committee was still arguing about it. They would argue about it for some time. That was fine. Cole had already moved on to the next page.